The laughter hit him before he even cleared the doorway. Loud, bright, the kind of laughter that didn't care who it cut. Ezekiel Beaumont stepped inside St. Aurelius Cathedral and felt the room decide, in less than 3 seconds, that he didn't belong there. No one said it. No one had to. It was in the way eyes moved and then moved away. It was in the half-second pause before conversations resumed. It was the specific silence that forms around a person when a room full of money looks at someone without it. The charity gala was already in full swing. Crystal glasses catching candlelight. Italian suits pressed sharp as paper cuts. Women dripping in borrowed diamonds. Men standing the way men stand when they own whatever room they're in. The Cathedral Restoration fundraiser had pulled out every heavy name in Manhattan, and every single one of them noticed Ezekiel's navy suit. It wasn't ruined. It wasn't dirty. It just wasn't theirs. He kept his chin level, kept his shoulders back. He had learned a long time ago that the only thing worse than being seen in a room that didn't want you was letting that room see you flinch. So he walked the way he always walked, measured, unhurried, like he had decided to be here and that decision was final. 2 men near the east column, Prescott Harlow and his associate, a wide-backed alpha named Damian Cross, didn't bother lowering their voices. "Beaumont," Prescott said, tipping his glass. "Still wearing that thing? What is that?" "A JCPenney clearance event." The people close enough to hear laughed. Ezekiel didn't answer. He moved further into the room, jaw set, eyes tracking forward. He knew how to survive a room that wanted to see him crack. He had done it before in places that made this cathedral look small. Hi viewers. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like the whole place was waiting for you to fail? Drop a yes or a no in the comments right now. He found a position near the back wall, beside a marble pillar. Far enough to breathe. Close enough to see everything. He stood with one hand loose at his side and the other holding a glass of water he had no intention of drinking, and he watched. The room performed itself. That was the only way he'd ever been able to describe events like this. Everyone in it was performing a version of themselves that cost money to maintain. The laughter was too full. The handshakes lasted a beat too long. The generosity being celebrated tonight was the kind that required an audience and a tax write-off to exist. He had been to enough of these to understand how they worked. He had also been out of them long enough to remember why he'd left. That was when the temperature changed. Not metaphorically. The actual air in the room shifted. Cooler, charged, the way a storm front moves through before a single drop of rain falls. Conversations dropped by half. Glasses paused at lips. Someone near the donation podium stopped mid-sentence and didn't finish it. The guards repositioned first. Ezekiel noticed that 4 of them, adjusting their spacing near the main entrance without a single spoken word between them. The kind of coordinated movement that only happens when a team has drilled the same response so many times it lives in their bodies now instead of their heads. Then the double doors swung open, and Raze Ardent walked in. He was late. By design, clearly. Raze Ardent didn't arrive on time to anything he didn't want to arrive early to. Lateness at his level wasn't rudeness. It was a statement about whose schedule mattered. He was taller than Ezekiel remembered. Or maybe that was just what power did to a body over 6 years. Stretched it, hardened it, made it fill more space than seemed physically fair. His charcoal suit was custom everything. His jaw was set the way iron sets. Final, cold, not asking for agreement. He moved without looking around for approval, which in a room full of people constantly looking for exactly that, made him impossible to look away from. The room reorganized around him without meaning to. Prescott Harlow stopped laughing mid-sentence and did not start again. Damian Cross took a single step back. A small step, the kind a man takes when his body understands something his pride hasn't caught up to yet. Race's eyes moved across the room the way a man reads a report. Fast, clinical, storing information. He didn't stop on Prescott. He didn't linger on the dignitaries gathering near the donation podium. He moved through the room visually the way he moved through it physically. Like it was a space he was passing through, not one he needed to impress. He stopped on Ezekiel. 1 beat. 2. Something moved behind those gray eyes. Not surprise. Raze Ardent did not do surprise in public. Something older than that. Something that had been sitting in a room with the door closed for 6 years and had just heard a sound it recognized through the wall. Then Prescott tried to recover. He pushed out a short laugh, started to say something toward Raze's direction. Some reaching attempt at relevance, some bid to be noticed by the one person in the room worth being noticed by. Raze didn't look at him. Continue, he said. Just that. 2 syllables, flat and final, and Prescott Harlow's mouth closed like a drawer being shut. The room exhaled. Ezekiel stood perfectly still against his marble pillar, watching Raze cross toward the council section of the event without another glance at him. No acknowledgement. No introduction. No defense of what had just happened at the East Column. No signal to the room that Ezekiel was anything other than what Prescott had made him out to be. Nothing. The humiliation Ezekiel had walked in carrying got heavier, not lighter. He'd told himself on the drive over that Raze wouldn't notice him. That would be fine. Normal. 6 years of silence had to mean something. He had prepared himself for invisible. He had rehearsed invisible on the way here, had talked himself into believing that invisible was livable. He had not prepared himself for seen and still left standing there. Those were different things. Invisible meant you didn't register. This was something else. This was being registered, being held in someone's gaze for 2 full seconds, and then being set aside like a file that would be dealt with later. In front of everyone. He stayed another 40 minutes because leaving early would have looked like retreat, and Ezekiel Beaumont did not retreat from rooms. He stood at his pillar. He drank his water. He watched the evening unfold around him with the patience of a man who had learned, over years and at some cost, how to be still inside discomfort. He was still thinking about the 2 seconds, the look, the calculation, the nothing that followed when a hand touched his shoulder. One of Raze's security detail. A tall woman with close-cropped hair and eyes that gave away exactly as much as she intended, which was nothing. "He wants a word," she said. She led him through a side corridor, past a door marked private, and into the cathedral's small confession chamber. Stone walls. A single candle burning on the ledge. The smell of old wood and something that might have been incense from an earlier service. Silence so thick it had texture. Raze was already there. His jacket was still on. His hands were in his pockets. He looked at Ezekiel the way a person looks at something they've spent a long time not looking at, with the specific combination of recognition and restraint that comes from practice. "You shouldn't be here," Raze said. His voice was low, controlled. "They're watching." Ezekiel looked at him for a long moment. "They're always watching," he said. "That's never stopped you before." Raze said nothing. His jaw moved once, the way it used to when he was running a calculation he hadn't finished yet. When he was deciding how much to say and how much to hold. And Ezekiel noticed it then. Raze's hands inside his pockets. The fabric shifted with the tension he was hiding. The knuckles weren't loose. The stillness he was projecting wasn't natural. It was constructed. This man, who had just walked into a room full of Manhattan's most powerful people and rearranged it without raising his voice, was nervous. And the only thing Ezekiel could think, standing in that stone-walled room with a candle burning between them, was why. What had Raze Ardent, after 6 years and a kingdom built in silence, to be nervous about? Unless it wasn't about the room. Unless it was about him. 6 years ago, Raze Ardent was not untouchable. He was 22, sitting cross-legged on a dormitory floor at 11 at night, eating cold rice from a paper container, explaining to Ezekiel why a certain chapter of Machiavelli was being misread by basically every political science professor on campus. His hair was unkempt. His jacket was secondhand, a gray wool thing with a fraying right cuff that he wore 3 days out of 5. His laugh, when something actually earned it, came from somewhere real. Not performed. Not calculated. Real. And that was the part Ezekiel spent years trying to forget. Not the face. Not the voice. The laugh. They met in an ethics seminar neither of them wanted to be in. Required course. Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The professor had a habit of calling on students without warning, and most of the class had learned to sit in the back 2 rows as insurance. Ezekiel sat in the front because he needed the grade and couldn't afford to miss a word. Raze sat in the front because Ezekiel eventually understood. He was the kind of person who found it personally offensive to have to do anything, even something he resented. They ended up beside each other by week 2. By week 3, they were the only 2 students who consistently argued with each other during open discussion, which the professor seemed to find both exhausting and useful. Ezekiel was on a scholarship, first generation, working 2 jobs. A dinner shift at a restaurant 4 blocks from campus and a Saturday morning logistics run for a warehouse on the west side. He carried the kind of quiet determination that people mistake for arrogance when it comes from someone without family money, when actually it's just focus. Just the particular concentration of a person who knows exactly what failure costs and has decided it won't happen. Raze was the son of Raze Ardent, heir to a syndicate that had its hands in half the city's private real estate, port access, and certain city contracts that nobody wrote papers about. He was enrolled under a different last name. He paid for things in cash when he could. He didn't talk about his family, his background, or what waited for him on the other side of a degree he was pursuing with a focus that seemed, to most people, disproportionate to someone who would never need the credential. Ezekiel figured out who he was in week 3. He didn't say anything about it. That, apparently, was what started it. They were careful. Both of them. An Omega Scholarship student and a syndicate heir occupied 2 different gravitational fields, and they both understood what it meant to be pulled across that line without a plan. They kept it to small rooms and back tables. Study sessions that started at 7 and ran past 10 without either of them noticing the time move. Conversations that went from coursework to philosophy to the particular kind of honesty that only happens between 2 people who've decided, without saying so, that they're safe with each other. Raze said once, during a winter that felt like it would never break, sitting beside Ezekiel on the floor of his dorm room with textbooks spread between them like a field they were both trying to cross. "You're the only person who talks to me like I'm a person first." He said it quietly, not looking for a response, just releasing it the way people release things they've been holding too long. Ezekiel hadn't known what to do with that, so he said nothing, and Raze smiled at the silence. A small, real smile, the kind that didn't need an audience, and they went back to the books. And somehow that had been enough. Somehow the nothing Ezekiel said had been received as everything Raze needed to hear. Those were the months Ezekiel kept returning to in the years that followed. Not the bigger moments. The small ones. The ones that had no ceremony. Then Raze Ardent died. Not slowly. Not with warning. A cardiac event on a Tuesday morning, the same Tuesday morning Raze would have been in the ethics seminar, which he wasn't because he'd gotten the call on his way across campus and simply turned around and disappeared. By Friday, he wasn't returning messages. By the following week, he was in meetings that Ezekiel had no knowledge of and no access to. By month's end, the Syndicate Council had formally moved Raze into successor position, and the press release that Ezekiel read on his phone in a university cafeteria used a last name Raze had never once said out loud in his presence. He didn't hear from Raze for 11 days. 11 days of nothing. No message. No explanation. Just absence, which in its own way was a kind of answer, but not one Ezekiel was ready to accept yet. When Raze finally appeared, standing outside the library at 7 in the morning, wearing a coat Ezekiel had never seen before, looking like he hadn't slept properly in all 11 of those days, Ezekiel didn't ask where he'd been. Didn't ask what had changed or what the next weeks would look like. He just waited, the way you wait for someone when you already know the shape of what they're carrying. Raze looked at him for a long time, long enough that 2 other students walked past them without either of them noticing. "If I keep you," he said finally, "they'll use you." His voice was flat, not cold, something worse than cold. Decided. The voice of a man who has already run the argument 100 times in his own head and arrived at a conclusion he doesn't like but has accepted. "To get to me," Raze said, "or to hurt me through you. You don't know what these people do with leverage. You don't know what they're willing to do to something a person loves." That word, loves, dropped into the middle of the sentence like it was incidental, like it wasn't the most important word he'd said. Ezekiel felt the cold move through him. Slow and certain, The way cold moves when it's not coming from outside but from something in your chest deciding to stop fighting what it already knows. So this is protection, he said. Not a question. More like someone reading the label off a bottle and confirming it matches what's inside. Raze said nothing. And that was when Ezekiel understood it. The silence wasn't cowardice. It wasn't cruelty either, though it felt like both from the inside. It was the particular violence of a man who has decided to be responsible for something larger than himself and cannot figure out how to carry that thing and also carry the people he loves. So he sets the people down, carefully, and tells himself it's temporary, and walks forward into the larger thing alone. Ezekiel didn't forgive it. Not right away. He was 22 and it felt unforgivable then. Clean, simple, the kind of wound that seems like it will never close. But he also didn't fight it. He understood the logic too well. He had spent his whole life being the person that other people couldn't afford to be associated with, for one reason or another. He knew what it felt like to be set aside by necessity. He just hadn't expected to feel it here. He walked back into the library and sat down in front of his books. And he waited for the ache to settle into something he could live inside. Something with edges he could map. Something that would hurt at a manageable level rather than this wide, shapeless way it was hurting right now. Took longer than he expected. 6 years later, he was still living inside it. He was thinking about that library. The smell of it, the specific quality of light that came through those east-facing windows on a winter morning. When his phone lit up on the nightstand at 2 in the morning, 3 weeks before the gala. A news alert. The kind that comes through before the full story is written. Before the journalists have time to frame it properly. Just the raw fact. The headline read, "Ardent Air Missing." Ezekiel sat up in the dark. His eyes adjusted. He read it again, then scrolled down to the 2 sentences below it. A child, 7 years old. Last seen leaving a private estate outside the city. No further details at this time. He stared at the screen until the light dimmed itself and the room went dark again. Then he sat in the dark for a while, turning it over. He had one question. Not about the child. Not about the syndicate or the circumstances or what any of this meant for the power structure of half the city. He wanted to know why, out of every person in Raze Ardent's world, every advisor, every council member, every operative who had spent years earning a place in that structure, the only call Ezekiel had received that week was from a number he hadn't saved but still recognized. Raze had called him first. No message. Just a call, missed, at 11:47 the night the news broke. And a second call at 12:15 that Ezekiel had been asleep for. He lay back in the dark and looked at the ceiling. 6 years of nothing. And then a missing child. And then his number twice in under 30 minutes. He already knew what he was going to do. He'd known it the moment he saw the headline. He just needed a minute to be honest with himself about why. Nero walked into the cathedral like he owned it, which, given his size, was not entirely an unreasonable impression. 140 pounds of black mastiff, moving low and deliberate through the carved stone entrance of St. Aurelius, his broad head sweeping side to side, processing the space the way animals process things. Not in pieces, not sequentially, but all at once. A full picture assembled in the first 3 seconds of entry. His collar was leather. His harness was tactical, the kind used in professional search operations, fitted so precisely to his body that it moved with him like a second skin. He walked beside Ezekiel without a leash because he had not needed one in 4 years. Nero operated on trust and training and something that functioned, in a dog of his intelligence, uncomfortably close to judgment. He didn't like this room. Ezekiel could tell by the way his ears stayed slightly back. Not threat posture, Nero would have planted and growled for that. This was assessment, caution, the body language of an animal that has walked into something complicated and is deciding how to move through it. Same honestly. The council chamber inside the cathedral went quiet when they entered. The kind of quiet that has texture. Not the silence of an empty room but the silence of occupied people choosing, all at once, to stop what they're doing and watch. Raze was at the head of a long table of dark wood, old and heavy, the kind that had probably heard things over the years that it couldn't repeat. 12 men arranged around it. Syndicate advisors, Ezekiel assumed, most of them older, all of them wearing the particular stillness of people who are accustomed to controlling outcomes and uncomfortable in moments they didn't script. Their eyes moved to Nero first, the way eyes always did. Then to Ezekiel. Then back to Nero with the calculation he had been watching people run his whole life, the quick unconscious arithmetic that ends with, small, quiet, not a threat, can be managed. Let them finish the math wrong. Ezekiel reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim tablet. He held it up, screen facing outward. On it, typed in plain block letters large enough to read from across the table, was a single line. "My dog can find your pup." Someone at the far end of the table laughed. Short, dismissive, the sound of a man who has never had to take anything seriously because everything in his life had already been arranged for him before he arrived at it. A man for whom rooms always opened. "He brought a dog," he said to the man beside him, not bothering to lower his voice. "He actually brought a dog to this meeting." The laughter moved around the table. Not everyone, but enough. The particular confidence of people in a group who believe they are the ones doing the deciding. Ezekiel kept his eyes on Raze. Raze kept his eyes on Ezekiel. He did not laugh. He did not shift. He sat at the head of that table with his hands flat on the surface and his expression set to the specific blankness that Ezekiel knew, from years of studying it, was not disengagement. It was attention with the surface removed. He was watching, calculating, and he said absolutely nothing to stop what was happening. Ezekiel had anticipated this. He had anticipated the dismissal, the noise, the laughter used as a wall. He understood how rooms like this functioned. They used mockery as a sorting mechanism. They laughed at what they didn't understand or couldn't classify, and if the thing being laughed at responded with anger or defensiveness, they had their answer. It was bait, and he had no intention of taking it. He waited until the room had finished enjoying itself. Then he turned the tablet to a second slide. A photograph. Nero in an urban field operation, moving through a block of commercial buildings at a low run, nose tracking, 3 trained handlers behind him struggling to maintain his pace. Below it, a case record. Date. Location. What was found. 3 missing children recovered across 2 separate operations over 18 months. 1 adult located after 72 hours. Evidence trail in a federal case that had led to 4 arrests. Timestamps on all of it. Documentation that had been verified, certified, and entered into public record. He held it up long enough for everyone at the table to read it. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. All at once, the way sound stops when something interrupts the frequency. Raze studied the tablet for a moment. Then he looked at one of the guards standing near the far wall and made a slight movement with 2 fingers. The smallest possible gesture. The kind that means something only if you've been trained to read it. The room began clearing. Efficient and without drama, the men who had been laughing stood and left, one by one, through the side door, like a sequence that had been prearranged. No argument, no questions. They simply went the way water goes when a drain is opened. When the chamber had reduced itself to 6 people plus Ezekiel, Raze finally spoke. "If this is a trap," he said, "you die first." Not theater. Not dominance display. The flat delivery of a man who has stated this kind of condition many times and had it understood many times and sees no reason to add drama to a policy. Ezekiel put the tablet away. "Nero doesn't do traps," he said. "He does trails." A brief pause in the room. The kind that fills with people recalibrating. "Why does he trust you?" One of the remaining advisors asked Raze directly. Older man. Heavy through the shoulders. The voice of someone who considered himself entitled to the question. No contact in 6 years. No active relationship with this organization. Why is he here instead of... "That's enough," Raze said. Not loud. Quiet, in fact. But the sentence ended. Raze said nothing further about trust or the 6 years or any of the reasons that existed in the space between them that no one in this room had clearance for. He simply stood and moved toward the chamber's rear exit, and the remaining men understood they were following. Ezekiel let Nero lead. The moment they hit open air outside the cathedral's service exit, the dog's behavior changed. Nose dropped within the first 5 feet. His body shifted forward, weight moving to his front legs, his stride lengthening into that specific focus pull that Ezekiel had learned to read over 4 years of working with him. Not casting, not searching, tracking. The difference mattered. Casting meant the scent was diffuse, uncertain. Tracking meant Nero had something solid and was following it with the focus of an animal that does not let go of a thing once it has found it. They had expected him to move south or east, toward the waterfront, in the direction of whatever rival faction the council had been quietly pointing toward as responsible for the disappearance. Nero moved north. Then he stopped and sat. Squarely and deliberately, the way he was trained to indicate a find, not a direction, not a search in progress, but a location. Here, this, directly in front of a dark SUV parked 60 feet from the cathedral's main entrance. A vehicle that had been sitting there long enough that no one had noticed it anymore. Invisible in the way that familiar things become invisible. Ezekiel looked at the plates, then at Raze. Raze's face had gone to stone. The vehicle was registered to Ardent Private Security. The scent Nero had found. The scent that connected to a 7-year-old boy and a missing trail and whatever had been set in motion days ago, wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. From someone who had access, clearance, proximity. Someone who had been in this building tonight. The tunnels under Manhattan are not supposed to exist. Not these ones. Not the ones that move below the utility infrastructure, below the subway lines, through corridors that were laid in an era when certain kinds of power conducted their business underground because that was more efficient than pretending it happened above ground. They existed because money and time and sufficient reason could build anything in this city, including the means to disappear inside it. Ezekiel had learned about them the same way he'd learned about most things in Race World. From proximity. From being close enough, long enough ago, that certain information had moved between them before either of them understood what they were actually building. Nero moved through the darkness ahead of them with the ease of an animal unbothered by the absence of light. His shoulders worked. His nose stayed low. Behind him, Ezekiel kept one hand loosely on the harness handle. Not to guide, just to maintain contact, the way you keep a hand on a wall in a dark room, not because the wall is leading you anywhere but because the contact itself is information. Raze walked just behind Ezekiel's left shoulder, close enough that Ezekiel could hear his breathing. It was controlled and even the measured breath of a man who has learned to regulate his body under pressure. But the rhythm of it, just slightly faster than rest, told the truth his expression wouldn't. He was afraid, not of the tunnels, not of whatever was ahead. He was afraid of what the vehicle had meant. Of what it implied about the structure he had built and the people inside it. Ezekiel understood that particular fear. It was the fear of discovering that the walls you trusted were thinner than you thought. The trail from the vehicle had led them here through a sequence that Nero assembled with mechanical patience. East Tunnel access near the Cathedral District, a freight relay junction 3 levels down, a maintenance shaft that opened into a parking structure 3 blocks north. In that structure they found a phone. Burner. Factory wiped. Left in the space between 2 support columns where it would have stayed invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. It wasn't completely clean. Orion Webb. Race technical specialist. A quiet man with the focused precision of someone who is very good at one specific thing and has organized his entire personality around that fact. Recovered 7 minutes of call metadata. The numbers had been scrubbed. The account was gone, but the cell tower data was still embedded in the hardware's passive logs. And it pointed northeast, out of the city, toward the old vineyard estates that had been in legal dispute since a contested inheritance 2 years prior. Empty buildings. No active residents. No reason for anyone to be there. Every reason for no one to be looking. They drove in convoy. 2 vehicles. Raze in front with Orion. Ezekiel in the back of the second car with Nero across his knees. The dog's broad head heavy and warm. His breathing slow and steady in the way of an animal conserving energy between tasks. Ezekiel sat with his hand on Nero's back and thought it through. The vehicle. The scent. The tunnel route. The burner phone left behind, not destroyed, just wiped, which was a different choice. You destroy things you don't want found. You wipe things you believe won't be looked at too closely. Wiping was confidence, or carelessness, or both. This was not a kidnapping for ransom. Ransoms had a logic to them, clean, transactional, almost honest in their way. Someone takes a thing, names a price, waits for payment, returns the thing. The goal is the money. The child is the currency. The whole structure depends on the target having both the resources to pay and the motivation to do so quickly and quietly. But this had none of those markers. No demand had been made. No window had been given. No proof of life delivered to trigger the clock. A ransom without a demand wasn't a ransom. It was a message. And messages weren't about money. They were about power. You take what a man loves most. Then you wait. Then you watch what the absence does to him. Watch the decisions he makes without it, the alliances he reaches toward, the vulnerabilities that open up in him when he is desperate and moving fast and not thinking with his full mind. Then, when he is shaped by the absence into something slightly different from what he was before, then you make your offer. And the offer is never money. It's always something structural. Something about how authority gets distributed going forward. Succession destabilization. Not a heist. A reshaping. The vineyard appeared at the end of a long gravel road. Old fieldstone gray against a darker sky. 3 stories with windows that had been shuttered from inside. Nero was off Ezekiel's lap before the car stopped moving. Standing at the door with his body taut and his attention locked forward. They cleared the first floor in 8 minutes. Empty. Cold. The smell of a space that had been occupied recently enough to leave traces in the air, but recently enough that whoever had been there was already gone from these rooms. Second floor. Third door on the right, a room at the back of the building with a small high window and a lock that had been added recently, the hardware still bright, not yet worn by use. Orion had it open in under 90 seconds. A boy. Small. 7 years old, which meant he looked younger in sleep. The sleep of someone who had been helped into it. The heavy stillness of a child given something to keep him quiet. His breathing was slow but regular. Brown skin. Thick dark hair. One hand loosely curled near his chin. The way small children sleep when they are exhausted and trusting and the world has not yet taught them to be anything else. Raze crossed the room in 3 steps and knelt. He didn't grab. He didn't pull the boy toward him or shake him awake or do any of the urgent things that fear might have pushed a different man toward. He placed one hand carefully on the child's back. And he crouched there in the light coming through the doorway, and something happened to his face that had nothing to do with the man who walked into charity galas and rearranged the temperature of rooms. It was the face underneath the face. The one that didn't perform. Ezekiel stayed in the doorway and watched it happen and felt the old ache move through him with the specificity of something that knows exactly where to press. The boy stirred. His eyes opened slowly, the way eyes open when the body is still fighting towards sleep and losing. He looked at Raze, unfocused, blinking once and then twice. Then, in a voice still thick and slow, "They knew." Raze went very still. "The man who drove us." The boy's voice was fading, pulling back toward unconsciousness. "He knew the route already, before you told him." Raze didn't move for a long time. Long enough that Orion, standing just inside the door, glanced at Ezekiel with an expression that asked a question neither of them had an answer to yet. The route had been assigned that morning. Internal only. Not written anywhere that left the Ardent network. The driver would have received it through secure channel, same as the detail, same as the protocol that had been in place for years. The only way to know it in advance was to have been inside the communication before it was sent. On the drive back, the boy asleep against Ray's shoulder, Orion's phone rang. He answered it, listened for 40 seconds without speaking, ended the call. "Callum Reed is dead," he said. Quiet, factual. The way professionals deliver the things they need to deliver without letting the weight of them land on their voice. His apartment, 40 minutes ago, before we had any chance to move on him. Head of Ardent Security. The man who had built the internal communication system the route had traveled through. The man who would have been the first person Raze pulled in for questioning once the vehicle's registration surfaced. Gone. Clean. Before a single question could be asked. Someone had been watching the thread from the moment it was pulled, and they had cut it before it could lead anywhere, which meant they were still in position, still watching, still managing the board. And they had just watched Raze find the boy alive. Ezekiel looked out the window at the dark highway and thought about what you do with a piece of information when you can't yet prove it and can't yet use it, and the person who needs to know it is sitting 3 feet away from you. He kept it for now. He needed to be sure first. The war started without a single gunshot. Most of Manhattan wouldn't have noticed. To the city, the weeks that followed looked like the ordinary motion of corporate life. Board resolutions filed in county records, regulatory audits initiated by agencies that audited things routinely, supply contracts transferred between vendors in language too dense for most people to want to read. Nothing that would interrupt a news cycle. Nothing that looked from outside like anything other than paperwork. But Ezekiel was inside it now, close enough to see what the paperwork meant. And what it meant was that Raze Ardent was taking things apart. He did it the way a person dismantles something that was built to last. Not by force, not by announcing what he was doing, but by removing the pieces that held everything else in place. One at a time, in the correct order, so that by the time the structure was visibly compromised, the work was already finished. A distribution contract covering 3 city districts transferred to a competing operator after a supplier agreement expired without renewal. The supplier, it emerged through a quietly commissioned audit, had been routing a portion of its operating revenue through a shell company. The shell company's registered address appeared, on closer examination, on documents belonging to a property jointly held by 2 Ardent Council members and a third party whose name appeared nowhere in the organization's official records. The kind of thing that reads as coincidence until someone decides to read it as evidence. A federal liaison. A man who had been providing unofficial regulatory cover for certain port operations for nearly a decade, was referred to a congressional oversight committee through an ethics complaint filed by a legal advocacy nonprofit. The nonprofit had received a significant anonymous donation approximately 6 weeks before the complaint was filed. The timing was legally immaculate. The donation was untraceable. The complaint was airtight. Territory agreements renegotiated. Internal votes formally recorded for the first time on matters that had previously been settled through informal consensus, which meant they now had a paper trail. Financial documentation appearing in the hands of regulatory bodies through channels that would take investigators months to trace back to their origin. Not revenge. Ezekiel had watched enough people chase revenge to know what it looked like, and it didn't look like this. Revenge was loud. It needed an audience. It needed the person being punished to understand what was being done to them and by whom. This had none of that. This was something colder and more complete. Raze was not trying to humiliate anyone. He was trying to make sure that what they had built could not be rebuilt. Ezekiel had access to the secondary operations floor. Raze had given him that after the vineyard estate, without explanation, with the same 2-finger gesture he used to clear rooms, directed this time at the woman with close-cropped hair who had led Ezekiel to the confession chamber. She had taken him to a workstation, given him a security clearance at a level that was not nothing, and left without commentary. Nero had been given water and a mat in the corner and had settled into his professional stillness, tracking the room with his eyes but otherwise still. Ezekiel was not part of the strategy. He was clear-eyed about that. Whatever role he occupied here was not advisor or partner or anything with a formal name. He was somewhere in the overlap between useful and something Raze hadn't categorized yet. He accepted that. He worked with what he had access to and let the rest alone. He was reviewing a board approval document, a procedural vote that would realign $3 million in operational capital away from a subsidiary whose beneficiaries included 2 council members and that unnamed third party. When Raze appeared at his shoulder, Ezekiel didn't look up. "This isn't revenge," he said. Raze picked up a second document from the stack beside the tablet. He read it without responding. "Revenge has noise to it," Ezekiel continued. "There's heat in it. This doesn't have any heat." He heard Raze set the document down. "Erasure," Raze said. "Just the word." flat and final, like a period at the end of something that didn't require further punctuation. Ezekiel looked at him then. Raze was looking at the board approval. Not at Ezekiel. At the document, at the vote that would move money and shift structure and quietly eliminate one more thing that should not have existed. They built something they thought was invisible, Raze said. I'm not interested in making them answer for it publicly. I'm interested in making it stop existing, so that whoever comes after, whoever tries to build the same thing in the same space, finds nothing to build on. Ezekiel didn't reply. There was nothing to add to that. It was complete as stated. The operations floor cleared down to a skeleton crew around 9 in the evening. Most nights, Raze left last. Not because there was always work remaining, but because leaving before the room emptied sent a signal he refused to send. Presence meant control. So he stayed. This particular night, he wasn't working. He was standing at the window that overlooked the east side of the city. The part of Manhattan that didn't make the postcards, that was all working infrastructure and old buildings and the kind of mixed commercial and residential that hadn't been fully converted yet, where the city showed its actual bones. He stood there for a while without speaking. Ezekiel, at his workstation, let him. Then Raze said, without turning from the window, I thought leaving you would keep you safe. The room was quiet enough that the words landed clearly. No ambient noise to absorb them. Just the statement placed into the air between them. Ezekiel set down the stylus he'd been holding. 6 years ago, Raze continued, still facing the window, the city lights sitting low and orange outside the glass, the way they do on nights when the air holds a certain kind of weight. I told myself that distance was protection, that if I removed the visible connection between us, there would be nothing to find, nothing to use. Did it work? Ezekiel asked. The question sat between them for a moment. No one touched you, Raze said. That's not what I asked. Longer silence this time. The kind that has mass. Raze turned from the window. He looked at Ezekiel the way he had looked at him in the confession chamber, with the weight of a man who made a decision he has been reconsidering from the moment it was made. Not regret exactly. Something more honest than regret. Something that acknowledged both the decision and the cost of it without trying to collapse one into the other. He didn't say anything more, and Ezekiel didn't push. Some things didn't need to be pulled apart any further than they already were. Some things just needed to be acknowledged and then carried forward differently. He turned back to the tablet. He had been running a secondary financial check. Not assigned to him, not part of any task Raze had given him. Just something he'd noticed at the edge of the data he'd been processing. A pattern in the timing of certain outgoing transfers. Most of the financial movement in the operation had a rhythm to it, predictable intervals, consistent routing, the signature of systems that had been running the same way for years. This was different. These transfers had a different cadence. Slightly irregular. Slightly offset from the rest. He'd flagged it mentally an hour ago and come back to it now. He pulled the routing data forward. Encrypted. Offshore flags. Not through the standard Ardent channels. Not through the subsidiary network they'd already begun dismantling. Through a separate account with no visible connection to the organization at all. Except one. The account structure. The format of the account number. A specific sequence pattern that predated the current digital banking systems. A legacy format. The kind that was set up before electronic records were centralized, when accounts were opened in person with paper documentation and the numbers reflected a different set of protocols entirely. The kind of account that would only be recognizable to someone who had been working inside the Ardent financial structure for a very long time. Long enough to remember how things were done before the systems that currently ran everything. Ezekiel sat with that for a moment. He ran the timeline in his head. Who in the current council structure had that kind of institutional history, who had been inside the organization long enough to know the legacy format existed, who had the standing and the access and the trust required to operate a channel that clean, that invisible for long enough that no one had thought to look for it. The list was not long. One name sat at the top of it without competition. Council Chairman Aldrich Beecham, Raze's uncle. The man who had been in the Ardent structure since before Raze was born. The man who had helped manage the transition after Carver Ardent's death. The man who sat at the left hand of the successor position and had, from every visible angle, been a source of stability and continuity through a difficult period. Ezekiel stared at the screen. He thought about the boy in the vineyard, the wiped phone with the tower data that hadn't been fully cleaned. The security chief found dead before a single question could reach him. He thought about the speed of that, the precision of it, the way each thread had been cut at exactly the moment it became visible, which meant someone had been watching each thread the entire time, waiting for the moment it was pulled. Someone who was present for everything. Someone who received all the information as it moved. Someone whose position put him at the center of the structure without appearing to have a hand in its direction. That wasn't reaction. That was management. That was someone who had been running a parallel operation inside the organization, patient and invisible, for long enough that it had become structural. Load-bearing. Hidden inside the walls. Ezekiel turned the tablet face down on the table. Raze was still at the window, his back half turned, looking at the city. Ezekiel looked at him. At the line of his shoulders. At the particular stillness of a man who has already been carrying too much and doesn't yet know there's more coming. He needed proof first. Something that couldn't be explained away, couldn't be reframed, couldn't be made to look like coincidence by someone with enough standing and enough time in position to control how the council received information. He needed to be certain before he said the name. Because once he said it, there was no version of this where Raze didn't have to look at the person who had been closest to him through every hard year since his father died and understand what that person had actually been doing with that closeness. That moment would come. It was coming. But not tonight. Tonight, he turned the tablet back over, opened a new search window, and started building the case. Comment below. If you were Ezekiel right now, do you tell Raze tonight? Or do you find the proof first? And do you think Raze already suspects something? Or is he completely blind to it? Let me know what you think. He walked into the council chamber wearing Raze's coat. Nobody had told him to. Nobody had suggested it. Ezekiel had simply picked it up from the back of the chair in the operations room where Raze had left it the night before, and he had put it on, and he had walked through the doors of the Ardent Council chamber at 9:47 in the morning without an invitation and without an escort and without asking anyone whether it was a good idea. The coat was charcoal wool, custom cut. It sat wide on Ezekiel's shoulders in a way that was, technically, imperfect. Too broad, too long at the hem, clearly made for someone else's body. But that was, in a room full of people who read every visual signal placed in front of them, precisely the point. You didn't wear a man's coat by accident. You wore it because you wanted everyone in the room to understand something that hadn't been said out loud yet. The chamber went quiet the moment he entered. 12 council members around the table. 6 advisors along the walls. Aldrich Beecham at the far end. Race's uncle, council chairman, the man whose name lived on a piece of financial evidence that Ezekiel had been building a case around for 2 weeks. Sitting with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something that looked like patience but was, on closer reading, calculation. Raze was at the head of the table. He looked at Ezekiel when he entered. His face didn't change, but something moved in his eyes. A flicker of something between recognition and the specific alertness of a man who has learned to read unexpected developments quickly and respond to them faster. He said nothing, which meant Ezekiel could. He took a position along the side wall, standing, not seated, with his hands loose and Nero at his left side. He had brought the dog deliberately. Nero's presence in this room had a history now. The council knew what he was capable of and what his nose had already found. The dog was not a prop. He was a reminder. The meeting had been in session for 20 minutes before Ezekiel arrived. Something about contract restructuring in the Southern Territory. It continued for another 10, and Ezekiel stood and listened and let the room adjust to the fact of him being in it. Then Aldrich Beecham leaned back in his chair and said, with the measured ease of someone who has been composing a line for exactly the right moment, "Still playing house with strays?" He was looking at Raze when he said it, but the sentence was directed at the room, at everyone in it. A public invitation to laugh at something that hadn't been formally introduced, that had no official standing, that could be dismissed without consequence. Raze said nothing. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. Long enough for it to become something the room noticed. Ezekiel spoke. Not loudly. He didn't need volume. The chamber had good acoustics and the room was already quiet enough to hear a chair shift. "Chairman Beecham," he said, "I want to talk about the Meridian account." The temperature changed. Not the way it changed when Raze walked into a room. That was a cold front moving in, wide and clean. This was something more localized. Specific. The particular chill that moves through a room when something that was supposed to stay buried gets named in public. Aldrich's expression didn't break. He was too experienced for that. But the quality of his stillness changed. It went from chosen to necessary, from the patience of someone who controls a room to the stillness of someone who is deciding very quickly how much damage has just been done and by what route. The Meridian account, Ezekiel continued, was opened through a legacy Ardent financial structure that predates the current digital banking framework. It has been receiving encrypted recurring transfers for the past 4 years through a routing configuration that doesn't appear in any current organizational record. He paused. Let that sit. It does appear in the federal documentation package that was filed with the Oversight Committee 14 days ago. The room was completely still. Silence protects systems. He had understood that for years. It protects the people running them and the structures holding them up. It protects the men sitting around tables like this one, who count on the people who know things to say nothing, because saying nothing has historically been the safest available option. He was done with that calculation. The account, he said, traces to financial activity connected to a trafficking logistics network that operated through 3 port facilities between 2019 and 2023. 2 of those facilities were under Ardent distribution contracts during the same period. He watched the council members, watched the ones who already knew shift almost imperceptibly in their seats, watched the ones who didn't know go very, very still. Aldrich Beecham looked at Raze. Raze looked back at him with an expression that was entirely empty of surprise. And in that moment, in the 3 seconds of eye contact between them across that long dark table, Ezekiel understood that Raze had known. Not everything, not the full shape of it, but enough. Enough to have let this morning happen the way it was happening. Enough to have left his coat on the back of that chair. The council vote came 40 minutes later. 8-4 in favor of a formal internal investigation. Not unanimous, but enough. Aldrich Beecham voted against. Of course he did. He also made, in those 40 minutes, 3 brief statements that were careful and measured and designed to reframe what had been presented as circumstantial and speculative. He was good. Ezekiel gave him that. He had spent decades in rooms like this one and he knew how to use language the way a person uses a hand to slow a bleed. Not enough to stop it, but enough to buy time. The meeting adjourned. Ezekiel moved toward the side exit. Nero walked beside him, unhurried, reading the room on the way out the same way he'd read it on the way in. They were 30 feet from the door when the shot came. Not inside the chamber. Outside. A sharp crack from the direction of the main corridor, muffled through stone and wood but unmistakable. The sound that does not sound like anything else no matter how many times you've heard it or how far away it is. Ezekiel's body moved before his mind caught up. He was through the side door and into the corridor, Nero already ahead of him when the second sound came. Not another shot, but the hard impact of a body against a wall, and a voice he didn't recognize saying something short and clipped in a language that wasn't English. Then running footsteps, moving away, not toward. He pressed against the wall. Assessed. Clear left. Clear right. The footsteps were already fading. Nero had stopped 3 meters ahead, facing the direction they'd come from, body taut and alert but not pursuing. Ezekiel hadn't given him the command and Nero didn't move on instinct alone. The corridor was empty, but there was a mark on the wall to Ezekiel's right. A fresh gouge in the stone at roughly chest height, where something had impacted at speed and ricocheted. He stood very still and understood what had just happened. The shot hadn't been random. It hadn't been a warning. It had been aimed at him. Someone had moved within minutes of the vote. within minutes of his name becoming associated with the Meridian account in front of 12 council members and 6 advisors. That was not improvised. That was prepared. That was someone who had anticipated this moment and had a response already staged. He looked at the mark on the wall. Then he looked at Nero. "Find," he said quietly. Nero put his nose down and moved. The bridge was wet. Rain had come in fast off the river, the kind of March rain that doesn't build gradually but arrives all at once. Full weight, like something that had been held back and finally released. The road surface was slick. The lights on the far side of the bridge were smeared and distant through the water on the windshield. Raze was driving, where he had been, until the black SUV that had been following them since the 3rd Avenue intersection accelerated out of the right lane, crossed the center line, and hit them. The impact came from the passenger side, Ezekiel's side, hard enough to push the car sideways across the wet road surface, tires screaming against the loss of traction. Ezekiel's right shoulder hit the door. Nero in the back lurched against the seat. The windshield held. The car didn't roll. Raze had corrected fast, hands already moving, pulling left and fighting the slide with the specific controlled response of someone trained for exactly this. They came to a stop against the bridge railing. Steam or smoke, it was hard to tell which, rose from the front left. The SUV had stopped 20 feet ahead. Its door opened. A man got out, then 2 more from the back. Raze looked at Ezekiel. 1 second of eye contact. A full read done in that single second. "Are you hurt? Can you move? Do you understand what we're about to do?" Ezekiel nodded. They moved fast. Raze out of the driver's side, using the door as cover, pulling something from inside his jacket that he'd had there since the council chamber. Ezekiel out the passenger side, lower, staying below the railing line. Nero out behind him. Ezekiel had the back door open and the dog was out before the 3rd man from the SUV had fully cleared the vehicle. It was not a long confrontation. The men from the SUV were professionals. Not the best Ezekiel had ever seen. The best he had ever seen didn't miss their approach angles in the rain, but trained. They moved with purpose and they moved fast, and the one thing working against them was that they had expected this to be easier than it was. They had not planned for Nero. The dog hit the right flank at full speed and the engagement collapsed from there. 30 seconds of movement. The bridge rail at Ezekiel's back. The sound of the river below them, wide and black and indifferent. Raze took the center man. Ezekiel took the one trying to reposition around the back of their car. He had the man down and was turning to assess the 3rd when he heard it. A single shot. Different from the fight sounds, separate, slightly delayed, coming from a different angle. Higher ground. Someone positioned before the ambush, separate from the 3 in the SUV, waiting for the moment the engagement opened up enough to get a clear line. The sound of a body hitting the wet road. Ezekiel spun. Raze was down on one knee on the bridge surface. His right hand was pressed flat against his left side, just below the ribcage, and the rain was hitting the back of his jacket and running down, and the color that was spreading beneath his hand was not the color of rain. The shooter's position was already empty. Whoever had been there was gone. 1 shot clean and then nothing. The remaining 2 men from the SUV had pulled back to their vehicle the moment Raze went down. The SUV reversed fast, turned, accelerated south. The bridge was empty. Just Ezekiel, and Nero, and Raze on his knee on the wet road, breathing through his teeth in the particular controlled way of a man who is deciding in real time how bad it is and what it means for the next 10 minutes. Ezekiel was beside him in 3 steps. His hand went over Raze automatically, pressing. Raze let him, didn't pull away, didn't say anything for a moment, just breathed, and the rain came down on both of them equally. "Hospital," Ezekiel said. "No. Immediate. No deliberation. Raze. Public hospital means a report. A report means the investigation stalls. Beauchamp's lawyers move before I'm out of the operating room." He was still breathing through his teeth, but his voice was steady. The voice of a man who has decided what matters more than pain. "There's a safe house. Orion has the address. Call him." Ezekiel looked at the wound, looked at Raze's face, looked at the blood on both their hands. He understood the logic. He had understood it before Raze finished saying it. The logic was sound. The investigation, if it stalled now, before the federal documentation had moved far enough to be out of reach, could be buried. A council chairman with 40 years of political relationships and a federal liaison already compromised and 3 council members who voted the wrong way. He had the tools to do it. All he needed was time and Raze in a hospital bed with cameras outside the door. The logic was sound. He still hated it. "Get up," Ezekiel said. He got an arm under Raze's shoulder. Raze pushed himself up with the wall of the railing and his own jaw set like a lock, and they got to the car, and Ezekiel got him into the passenger seat and went around and got in and called Orion before the door was closed. Orion answered on the second ring. He already knew someone had been monitoring. He gave the address in 12 words and ended the call. Ezekiel drove. The rain was still coming down. The bridge lights moved behind them and the city opened up ahead and Raze sat with his hand pressed to his side and his head against the headrest and his eyes open, watching the road, refusing to close them. "You should have let me take that position," Raze said. About 3 minutes in. Low, slightly strained. "Which one?" "The one by the railing. I knew the sight line from up there. I should have anticipated." "Stop." Raze stopped. The rain was loud on the roof of the car. Nero was pressed against the back of Ezekiel's seat, his nose at the headrest, as close to both of them as the space allowed. The safe house was a 4th-floor apartment in a building on the north side. Clean. Equipped. A woman was already there when they arrived, Imani Dorset, who Ezekiel had not met before and who introduced herself with her first name only and immediately began doing things with a medical bag that suggested a surgical background that she was not in the mood to explain. She asked Raze 2 questions. He answered both. She told Ezekiel to hold pressure where she indicated, and he did, and she worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before in conditions worse than these. 40 minutes in, Raze's blood pressure dropped. Not dramatically, not all at once. The monitor Imani had attached to him registered it first. A slow trend, the wrong direction, the number not alarming but moving in a way that she watched for 2 minutes before she said, without looking up from what she was doing, "I need you both to understand that what happens in the next several minutes will determine the next several hours." She was already moving when she said it. Her hands were already doing something different, something faster, and the monitor beeped once and then flatlined. 3 seconds. Long enough for the sound to fill the room completely. Long enough for Ezekiel to feel it register in his chest like something physical, like a wall he had walked into in the dark. Then Imani did something with her hands and said one word sharply and the line came back. Uneven. Slow. But back. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the room and looked at Raze's face. Still, pale, absent in the way that a face goes absent when the body is using everything it has for something other than expression. And felt something happen inside him that he did not have a clean word for. Not panic. Something older. Something that had been waiting in the back of him for 6 years and now stepped forward without asking permission. He pulled out his phone. He called Orion. "Beauchamp's ports," he said. "The 3 Red Hook facilities. I want seizure initiated through the federal channel we opened last month. Tonight." Orion was quiet for exactly 1 second. "That's an aggressive move without Raze's direct authorization." "I'm authorizing it," Ezekiel said. Another second of quiet. "Understood," Orion said. He ended the call and put the phone in his pocket and looked at the monitor and waited. Ezekiel stopped sleeping past 4 in the morning. Not because he couldn't, because there was always more to do at 4 than at any other hour, and the quiet of that time. The specific empty quiet of a city that hasn't started performing itself yet, turned out to be the most useful thing available to him. He had been running things for 11 days. Not loudly, not with any announcement. He had simply continued doing what needed to be done, one task connecting to the next the way links connect in a chain, and the chain had grown longer and the weight of it had become familiar and he had adjusted to carrying it the way you adjust to any weight. Gradually, without ceremony, until one day you realize you have been holding it for so long that you can no longer clearly remember what it felt like to put it down. Raze was alive, recovering. He was 2 weeks out from the bridge, and the wound had not infected, and Imani Dorset had been back 3 times, and each time she left with an expression that moved incrementally closer to something that could be called reassured. He was not back on his feet. He was not directing anything. He was in the safe house with Nero. The dog had refused to leave, had installed himself on the floor beside the bed with the patient immovability of an animal that has decided this is where it is meant to be and no instruction to the contrary is going to change that. And he was healing. And Ezekiel was outside doing what needed doing. The port seizure had landed exactly the way he'd calculated. 3 Red Hook facilities, frozen through Federal Channel, the documentation already in the hands of the Oversight Committee before Aldrich Beauchamp's legal team had finished their morning coffee. The response from Beauchamp's people had been fast. Injunctions filed, a statement issued through a communications firm that described the seizure as politically motivated overreach, 2 council members who had voted for the investigation suddenly making themselves available for press comments that walked carefully close to the same framing without being directly coordinated with it. Of course, nothing so crude as coordination. It was clean, professional, the work of people who had managed situations like this before and had a playbook. Ezekiel had spent 11 days writing a different playbook. He worked through the scholarship network first, connections from the years before Raze, people he had maintained loose relationships with who had gone into law, finance, advocacy, municipal government. People who owed him nothing but trusted him enough to take a call. He spent those calls carefully. He didn't ask for anything that required them to take a risk they hadn't consented to. He asked for information, for introductions, for the names of other people who might take a call. From there, he mapped Aldrich Beauchamp's alliance structure the way you map a building before you take it apart, foundation first, then load-bearing walls, then the things that look structural but aren't. 3 of Beauchamp's council allies had financial exposure in the same shipping subsidiary as the Meridian account. Ezekiel's documentation connected them directly enough that their own legal teams, once presented with what was already in federal hands, advised immediate separation from Beauchamp's position. They separated. Without announcement, the alliance simply became thinner overnight. A second wave of bank freezes hit the week following the port seizure. This time through a different regulatory body, targeting a property holding company whose principal shareholders overlapped with 2 names in the Meridian account's downstream transfer records. Beauchamp's people filed another injunction. The injunction was reviewed by a federal judge who had been provided, through the appropriate channels several weeks prior, with a full copy of the trafficking logistics documentation that connected the Meridian account to the port facilities. The injunction was denied. Ezekiel was standing in the hallway outside a gallery on the Upper East Side when he got the notification from Orion. He read it once, put the phone in his pocket, pushed the gallery door open. Aldrich Beauchamp was inside. This had been arranged, though not by Beauchamp. Beauchamp believed he was attending a private viewing hosted by a collector he had done business with for 15 years. The collector was real. The invitation was real. The meeting that was about to happen was not something Beauchamp had agreed to. The gallery was white walls, carefully spaced paintings, the particular hushed quality of rooms where expensive things are displayed. Beauchamp was standing in front of a large canvas. Abstract, dark blues and grays, with a glass of something in his hand and the composed expression of a man who believed he still had the situation managed. He heard Ezekiel's footsteps. He turned. His expression shifted. Controlled, fast, but not fast enough to prevent the flicker of something unguarded in the first half-second. He recovered. Of course he did. "Mr. Beaumont," he said. Smooth, slightly tired. The tone of a man who is going to be generous about this meeting even though he finds it beneath him. "I didn't expect. You mistook quiet for harmless," Ezekiel said. He said it the way you say something that doesn't need decoration. Flat. Even. A statement of fact about a misreading that had consequences. Beauchamp's jaw tightened once. Just once. "The federal charges are circumstantial," he said. "My attorneys." "Your attorneys received the full Meridian account documentation this morning," Ezekiel said, "including the transfer records from 2021 that connect the account to a logistics coordinator who pled guilty to federal trafficking charges in November of 2023 and named his financial contacts as part of his cooperation agreement." He let that settle. Your name is in that cooperation agreement, Chairman. It has been in federal possession for 4 months. The gallery was very quiet. Beecham looked at him for a long moment. The glass in his hand was very still. You're an omega, he said, not a slur. Stated the way someone states a thing they are trying to use as an explanation. As if the word itself should clarify why none of this was supposed to be possible. As if the category of the person should determine what they were capable of. Ezekiel looked at him. Yes, he said simply. I am. He turned and walked out of the gallery. Behind him, he heard the glass set down on a hard surface. The sound of a man who has nothing left to hold on to putting down the last thing in his hand. Aldrich Beecham was arrested the following morning. Federal agents. His building lobby, 7:15 a.m., before his car arrived. The charges were detailed, extensive, and had been in preparation long enough that the paperwork was immaculate. Ezekiel was at the safe house when his phone showed him the news alert. He set the phone face down on the table and looked at the window and let himself feel it for a moment. The completion of something, the closed loop of a thing that had been moving toward this for weeks and had now arrived. Then he heard, from the other room, the sound of Raze's voice. Not talking on the phone. Not directing anything. Just speaking low and slightly rough from 2 weeks of limited use to Nero, who was apparently doing something the dog found personally acceptable and Raze found personally annoying. Ezekiel walked to the doorway. Raze was sitting up. Not all the way. Propped against the headboard, still pale, still careful with his left side, but sitting up, which was more than yesterday. Nero was on the bed. Raze was looking at the dog with the expression of someone who had decided some time ago that arguing with a 140-pound mastiff was not a productive use of limited energy. He looked up when Ezekiel appeared in the doorway. Beecham, he said. Not a question. This morning, Ezekiel said. Raze was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved over Ezekiel's face the way they always did. Reading, assessing, the habit of a man who gathers information from surfaces that most people don't think to look at. You've changed, Raze said. Not a criticism. Not entirely a compliment either. An observation. The honest recognition of someone who knew what Ezekiel had been before, and was now looking at what he had become during the weeks he'd been running things without permission and without apology and without stopping to ask whether the room approved. Ezekiel stood in the doorway. I know, he said. 3 weeks after the arrest, Raze stood up without help for the first time. Not dramatically. Not for an audience. He stood up in the safehouse kitchen at 6 in the morning because he wanted coffee and he was done waiting for someone to bring it to him, and Ezekiel, who was already at the counter with a mug in his hand, turned around and watched him cross the room with the careful, deliberate gait of a man relearning the agreement between his body and gravity. He made it to the counter. Poured his own coffee, stood there. Ezekiel handed him the mug he'd already prepared because he'd heard him getting up 3 minutes ago and had made it before Raze was through the door. Raze looked at the mug, then at Ezekiel. You knew I was coming, he said. I knew you were going to try, Ezekiel said. There's a difference. The corner of Raze's mouth moved. The smallest possible version of something that on another face would have been a smile. They stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet and drank their coffee and didn't say anything for a while. Nero was on his mat in the corner. Outside, the city was making its first sounds of the day, the particular combination of early trucks and distant sirens and pigeons on the ledge that meant New York was waking up in the direction of another ordinary morning, unbothered by what had happened inside it over the past weeks. That was the thing about this city. It moved forward regardless. It didn't pause to acknowledge what it had been through. It just went on, and you either moved with it or you got left behind. The weeks that followed the arrest had their own particular shape. The national investigation that the council chamber exposure had triggered moved into formal proceedings. Testimony, subpoenas, document requests extending outward from Beauchamp's network into connected structures that investigators had been watching for years, but hadn't had sufficient cause to move on. The media coverage was loud for 2 weeks and then became consistent and detailed, the kind of coverage that isn't exciting anymore but matters more for being sustained. The Ardent Council had dissolved its old structure and was in the process of reforming under a new governance charter. Something Raze had been designing, Ezekiel learned, long before the council chamber meeting. The charter included formal protections for Omega members of any affiliated organization, written into the foundational document, not amendable by simple majority. Ezekiel had read it 3 times when Orion sent it over. He hadn't asked to see it. Orion had sent it without explanation, which meant Raze had told him to. He was thinking about that, about the charter, about the protections written into it, about what it meant that they were there. When Raze appeared in the doorway of the room Ezekiel had been using as a workspace and said, without preamble, "I want to do the bond ceremony." Ezekiel looked up from the tablet. The words sat in the air between them. Bond ceremony. The formal thing. The thing with witnesses and documentation and the specific legal weight that changed what 2 people were to each other and to every structure that dealt with them going forward. He looked at Raze for a long moment. Raze stood in the doorway with his coffee and his still careful posture, and the expression of a man who had thought about this enough times that saying it out loud felt simultaneously like relief and exposure. "I've been thinking about it since the bridge," Raze said. "Maybe before that. Maybe before that," Ezekiel repeated. "Since you walked into that council chamber wearing my coat and said the name of an account I had been trying to locate for 4 months and did it in front of 12 men who had every reason to protect the person running it." He paused. "That's when I stopped being able to argue with myself about it." Ezekiel set the tablet down. He stood. He moved to the center of the room, where the light from the window was better, and he looked at Raze with the full weight of what he was about to say. "I don't want to belong to you," he said. "I need you to understand that before anything else. I spent 6 years building a life that belongs to me, and I am not giving that up. Not for a ceremony. Not for a title. Not for what it means inside any structure you're part of." Raze was quiet. "I want to stand beside you," Ezekiel said. "Not behind you. Not as something you protect by keeping at a distance. Beside you. On the same level. With the same standing. If that's what you're offering, then yes." He watched Raze take that in. Watched him turn it over the way Raze turned everything over, thoroughly, without rushing, until he had looked at it from every angle and understood what he was agreeing to. "That's what I'm offering," Raze said. Not quickly. Not as a reflex. As a deliberate statement from a man who understood exactly what the words cost and was paying them anyway. Ezekiel nodded once. The moment sat between them, clean and quiet, without needing to be anything larger than it was. 2 people in a room in the early morning, having said the true thing out loud for the first time without retreating from it. Then Ezekiel's phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at it. A notification from a news alert he'd set weeks ago. A video clip. Security footage from inside the council chamber, time-stamped from the morning of the vote. His voice, clearly audible. The names. The account. The trafficking documentation. All of it. Someone had released it. He didn't know who yet, but someone with access to the chamber's internal recording system had pushed the footage to 3 separate news organizations simultaneously. His phone started ringing. Then Raze. Then Orion was calling from the operations line. "The footage is everywhere," Orion said. "National. It's past containment." Ezekiel looked at Raze across the room. Raze was already looking at him. "A national investigation," Ezekiel said. "Formal proceedings," Raze confirmed. Within the week. Neither of them moved for a moment. The phones were still going. The world outside was already reorienting itself around something that had shifted in a room neither of them could put back the way it was. They had understood, both of them, that this was always where it was going. That once the first thread was pulled, the unraveling was going to go further than either of them could fully see from the beginning. They just hadn't known it would happen this fast. Or this publicly. 6 months later, St. Aurelius Cathedral looked different in the morning light. Same stone. Same stained glass catching the early sun and throwing colors across the floor that had nothing to do with the cold blue of the gala night, when the candles had been doing their careful work of making everything look more expensive and more certain than it actually was. This was natural light. Unmanaged. The kind that shows what a place actually looks like when it isn't performing. Ezekiel stood at the top of the cathedral steps and looked out at the street below and let the quiet sit on him for a moment before the day started doing what the day was going to do. 6 months. Council dissolved. New governance charter in effect. The Ardent organization had reformed under a structure with actual accountability mechanisms built into it, with rotating oversight, with the Omega protection provisions that Ezekiel had read 3 times and still returned to some mornings because there was something in seeing a right written down that was different from simply having it. Different in a way he couldn't explain cleanly and didn't try to. Aldrich Beecham had been sentenced 8 weeks prior. Federal court. 19 counts. The sentence was longer than his attorneys had told him to expect, which Ezekiel suspected had something to do with the cooperation agreement testimony that had been made available to the prosecution through a source his attorneys had never managed to identify. The national investigation had moved through 4 connected networks over the course of the 6 months, pulling threads that led to places the original Meridian account documentation hadn't specifically pointed to but had gestured toward. The investigation was ongoing. It would be ongoing for a while. These things didn't close fast when they were done properly, and the people running this one seemed committed to doing it properly. Raze had given testimony twice, voluntarily, without his attorneys advising him to. That had been covered extensively. It had also changed in ways that were visible even to Ezekiel, who was watching from close enough to notice the small shifts, how certain people in certain rooms understood what the Ardent organization was now and what it was trying to be. The morning was cold and clear. Manhattan in late fall, the kind of weather that is too sharp to be comfortable but too clean to complain about. Below the cathedral steps, a car was parked at the curb. Orion was inside it, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has learned that waiting is a significant portion of the job and has made a separate peace with that fact. The cathedral door opened behind Ezekiel. Footsteps on the stone. Raze came to stand beside him. Not behind. Beside. At the same level on the top step, close enough that their arms nearly touched, looking out at the same street, the same morning, the same city that had tried to swallow both of them at different points and had not succeeded. He was fully healed. The careful gait was gone. He stood the way he always stood, filling the space he occupied without apology. But there was something different in it now that Ezekiel had noticed over the past months and still hadn't found the exact word for. Something that wasn't softer exactly. Something that was more present, less defended, like a man who had stopped spending energy on the performance of being unreachable. From inside the cathedral, through the heavy door, came the sound of a child laughing. High and clear and completely unbothered by the weight of everything that had happened to reach this morning. Ezekiel's mouth did something without his permission. Nero was in there too. He had heard the dog's nails on the stone floor when the door opened, which meant the boy had found him, which meant Nero was currently tolerating something with the long-suffering dignity he reserved for situations he had decided to allow without actively encouraging. The laughter came again, slightly louder. The sound of a child who has found exactly the right thing. He's going to teach that dog bad habits, Raze said. Nero will survive it, Ezekiel said. That's not what I'm worried about. A pause. The street below them was starting its morning. A delivery truck making a stop 2 blocks down. 2 women walking a dog that was vastly less composed than Nero. A man with coffee moving in the particular hurried way of someone who is already late and has accepted it. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. The kind of morning that has no awareness of itself. I used to think about this, Raze said. Not loudly. The kind of thing you say when you've been holding it long enough that saying it out loud is less about the other person and more about letting the weight shift. About what? Ezekiel said. What it would look like. After. A brief pause. I had a version of it in my head for years. What after would look like if there was one. It didn't look like this. What did it look like? Raze was quiet for a moment. Cleaner, he said finally. More finished. Like a thing that had been completed and put away. He looked at the street. This doesn't feel finished. It isn't, Ezekiel said. No. There's the ongoing investigation. The charter review in the spring. The 3 connected cases that... That's not what I mean, Raze said. Ezekiel looked at him. Raze was still looking at the street. The morning light was hitting his face at a sideways angle, the way morning light does when it's coming in low and the shadows are still long, and in that light he looked not young exactly. Not the 22-year-old on the dormitory floor, but closer to that person than the one who had walked into the gala 11 months ago and rearranged the temperature of the room. "I mean us," Raze said. "It doesn't feel finished. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would feel if we ever got here." He paused again. "I thought there'd be a clear edge to it. A moment that said, this is the end of one thing, and now you know what comes next." Ezekiel turned back to the street. Below them, the city moved the way it always moved, forward, continuous, without waiting for anyone to decide they were ready. "There isn't one," Ezekiel said. "There's no edge. There's no moment that closes it and opens something else. It just keeps going. And you keep going with it, or you don't." Raze said nothing for a moment. Then, "And if I want to keep going with you in it?" Not a question exactly. Not a statement either. Something in the space between the specific grammatical shape of a person who has said what they mean and is leaving room for what comes back. "Then you do," Ezekiel said. "Same as me. Same pace. Same direction. No one deciding what the other one is allowed to be." The door behind them opened. The boy came through it at the particular speed of a 7-year-old who has somewhere urgent to be, which turned out to be the space between Raze's left side and the railing of the steps, where he inserted himself with the complete confidence of a child who has decided this is where he fits and is correct. Nero followed, moving with the dignity of an animal who has decided to accompany rather than chase, which was a distinction Nero maintained consistently and considered important. The four of them stood at the top of the cathedral steps in the November morning. Below them, the city. Above them, the sky doing what the sky does, moving, changing, not asking anyone's permission to become whatever came next. Raze reached out, not to take Ezekiel's hand, to place his palm open at his side, at the space between them. An offer without demand. The shape of a question that had already been answered and was now asking something different. Not whether, but how. Ezekiel looked at the open hand. Then he placed his own beside it. Not inside it. Beside it. Palm to palm, side by side, the way two people stand when they are not holding each other up but choosing, deliberately, to move in the same direction at the same time. They didn't know what came next. That was the honest thing. That was the thing neither of them was pretending otherwise about anymore. The investigation would continue. The charter would evolve. The boy between them would grow up inside a structure that had been built at significant cost to be safer than the one that preceded it. And Ezekiel would wake up every morning and decide again, the way you decide every morning about the things that matter, what he was doing and why and with whom. Today the decision was this. The morning, the steps, the city below moving forward without waiting, and the two of them walking into it together. Not certain, not finished, not arriving at anything that could be called complete. Just forward. Just this. From somewhere in Orion's car at the curb, a phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. The particular pattern of a notification that kept arriving, insistent, the world outside this moment already moving toward the next thing. The boy looked up at Raze. "Is that yours?" he asked. "Probably," Raze said. "Are you going to answer it?" Raze looked at Ezekiel. Ezekiel looked at the street. "In a minute," Raze said. Below the cathedral steps, Orion had gotten out of the car. He was looking up at them with an expression that was professional and patient and contained, around its edges, something that was not quite concern but was adjacent to it. The kind of look a person gives when they are carrying information that changes something and are waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Then Ezekiel noticed what was in Orion's hand. An envelope, thick, sealed. The stamp on the upper left corner was not a U.S. postmark. It was a crest, European, old. The kind used by organizations that had been operating long enough that they still sealed their correspondence in ways that most people associated with the past. Orion held it up, met Ezekiel's eyes, said nothing. The boy laughed at something Nero was doing with his ears. The city moved below them, indifferent and continuous and full of the next thing coming. And Ezekiel looked at the envelope and felt the particular sensation of something that had been closed for 6 months shifting, very slightly, in a way that suggested it was not as finished as anyone in this morning had believed. Not yet. If this story moved you, if you felt every turn, every silence, every moment where two people chose to keep going, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Stories like this remind us that second chances are real, that quiet strength is real, and that walking forward together, even when you don't know what's ahead, is one of the bravest things a person can do. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story on this channel. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did you believe they'd make it? And what do you think is inside that envelope? This community is built on people who show up, who stay, and who inspire each other. So stay. And we'll see you in the next one.